In our next installment of the Parsha and Halacha, we begin with a tshuva of the Maharam Shik, Rav Moshe Shik, one of the great Gaonim Poskim in Hungary, the door after the Chassam sefer. So in Shut Maharam Shik Yeredeya Siman Kuf Samachei, there is a tshuva dated Erev Rish Chodesh Adar Tov Reish Yud Vav. I have mentioned before that the convention of using Tes Vav for 15, while that is much older, the convention for using Tes Zayin for 16 is much later, and that as late as the 1800s, Yud Vav was still in use, and not just Tes Zayin. So in this case, he's still writing Tov Reish Yud Vav, or in Goyish years 1856. I actually saw this tshuva reproduced, at the beginning of the tshuva reproduced somewhere, and I saw they just casually changed it to Tov Reish Tes Zayin, but it says Yud Vav in the Makar. And the letter, the tshuva is addressed to Yedidi Harav Amor Agadol HaMefursam Chorutz V'Shanon, etc. Marino Harav Reb Yisroel Dovid, the Av Beistin of Pezung. Okay, that's all it says. Reb Yisroel Dovid, Av Beistin of Pezung. And the tshuva begins, Michtavai v'sifroi ksav yad kibalti b'yom hei. I received your letter and the manuscript of your sefer. I received them both on Thursday. And you asked for my opinion, right? So there's a rav, a mechaber, there's mechaber a sefer. Doesn't say the name of the sefer, but he submitted it to Maharam Shik for his opinion. So we'll begin with Maharam Shik's, the beginning of his response, and then we'll circle back around to figuring out who the Rav is and what the sefer is. Don't worry, you can hold that thought for a minute. Let's begin and see the connection to the Parsha. So Maharam Shik answers, Ashiv b'ktsara, I'll answer in short, the vada ya'emes b'fima losai. You're absolutely correct that anyone who does any kind of maisa, any kind of avodah, in order to compare himself, to imitate, to the umas v'goyei ha'aretz, you're over on a number of lavin. That's apparently the thesis of the Rav of the sefer. So you're correct. And therefore, those who build a shul and they put the bima in the front near Mizrach, in front of the Aron Kodesh, and they are mechaven maasehem v'koil zamoreihem lemenhagei avodas she'or ha'umas ledames atzmam lahem, and other conventions within the shul as well. For example, the singing is intended to imitate the way other umos practice and worship, and it's for the sake of imitating them. Oivrim bekam lavim. Absolutely, indeed, you're correct. What are the lavim? Beis lavim v'chukaseyim leiselechu and v'loi seichu b'chukas agoy. This taka and iser shaloi ledomis lahem. And it's a Rambam Hilchos Avodah Zarah Shulchan Aruch Yeredeya Siman Kuf Ayin Ches v'nichbal b'Parsha Sre'ei Hishomer lecha pen tinokesh achareim. Oh, so there's a pasuk in Parsha Sre'ei, v'nichbal b'Parsha Sre'ei. This pasuk. What's the pasuk? So it's towards the beginning of the Parsha. I think maybe it's in Shlishi. The Parakid Beis, pasuk Chavtes, Lamed, Lamed Aleph. So it says in pasuk Chavtes, Ki yachas Hashem alekachas agoyim asher atov v'shomo lareshes oisam mipanecha v'yarashta oisam v'yashavta ba'artzam. You're going to come, you're going to conquer, you're going to inherit the land. Be careful not to, however you translate tinokesh, granted not the topic here, but in the laws and the taich, there are two approaches to how to translate tinokesh, but let's assume for the purposes of our discussion, it's Melashon Moikesh, don't fall into the trap. So there's some kind of verb here, to be tinokesh achareim, to fall after them, to make a mistake in their footsteps. Ufen tidrosh leileihem leimor echa yavdu hagoyim ha'ela es aleihem ve'es akein gam ani. And you may inquire after their gods and say, how do these nations serve their gods? And I will do the same. So the next pasuk says, Lo yisas akein l'Hashem leikacha. That's what they do, Hashem hates, etc. The question is, what is this phrase, echa yavdu hagoyim ha'ela es aleihem ve'es akein gam ani? You want to find out what they're doing, and then I'm going to do it. Do it in what sense? So we'll get to that in a moment, but back to Maharam Shik. So this Isser, he says, is Nichbal and Parsha Sre'ei, he Shom Elcham Hatinakash Acharei. And he says it's a sefri. Sifri says that both the Hishamer is a leisase and the pen is a leisase. So there's like a double leisase here in this pasuk. And it says in the Sifri, Shlei Toimar, Hoyel Vehen Yoitzin, V'chulu Ani Yoitze. I believe it's a famous Sifri that they wear argama and you're going to wear argama and stuff like that. That's often quoted in the discussions of Chukas HaGoyim, but it's on this pasuk. Ayin Sham. Comes to Ram Shik and clarifies, V'hainu kipira shramban b'chum Hashem. In quoting this pasuk, invoking this pasuk, and using the Sifri, we're using the pirush, the mahalach of the Ramban. What's the mahalach of the Ramban? So, like I said, there's a question of ve'esa kengam ani, esa what? In what sense am I imitating? So Rashi says, they do avodah zara, and you'll also do avodah zara. How do they serve their gods? I also will serve their gods in the way that they serve their gods. So the Ramban, no. V'zeh inenu nochin, ki ha'kosav oimer le'sasa kein la Hashem le'kacha. The beginning of the next pasuk immediately is, don't do this to Hashem. So I guess in colloquial language, you can say, if you serve their gods the way they serve their gods, don't do that to Hashem. How could you do that to Hashem? But you take it a little bit more literally. If you read it as a well-known pasuk, you check to see how they serve their gods. You want to do the same. Don't do the same. Don't do this to Hashem. So it means that you're trying to learn from them as to how to serve Hashem. You're looking for clues, for ideas. They serve their gods in such glorious ways. Let's adapt those glorious modes of worship for Hashem. It's not a warning, not a lav about serving their gods, but rather not to serve Hashem following the modes of their service. Because the stuff that they do, Hashem hates. So, for example, the pasuk says they burn their children, they sacrifice their children to their gods. If you do that to Hashem, Hashem is not going to be very happy, which makes sense. That would be the kind of mindset back then. The modes of worship, the modes of behavior of the society around us, around them, could be very powerful. And if they worship their gods by sacrificing their children, so it's very likely that there could have been some kind of combined Jewish pagan mode of worship, and the pasuk is bavarining and saying not to do that. So that's a specific example the pasuk gives. But in a more general sense, like the Sifri says, whatever they're doing, whatever the specific modes of behavior that they have, don't adopt those and use them for Hashem. So Ram Shik says we're going here with the Taka with the Ramban that is referring to the Eibishter and like the Sifri says, so it means imitating them, but in the Jewish context. I'm going to pause here in the Maram Shik, but we already have a portion of a picture here. We have a sense of what the Maram Shik is talking about. There's this mechaber, there's the sefer, and the examples being given are moving the bimah and other changes in the worship in Shul. So clearly this is in the context of the battle against the reform, the early reform and the changes they were making that were intended to bring Jewish worship more closely in line with the worship lahavdil in the church, etc. And since the Maram Shik is invoking this pasuk, so what we essentially see is that our Parsha, this pasuk in our Parsha, is apparently, seemingly, an important yisoid in this discussion. So, very worthy topic to discuss for this week in the context of the Parsha in Halacha. Now, the Maram Shik continues, and we'll get back to that. But now to the question of who's the recipient of the tshuva, who's the tshuva written to, and what is the sefer in Ksav Yad? So, as it happens, I already found the answer a year ago. Mamash came out a year ago, the beginning of Chodesh of Tavshin Peidal. I was in a shul that I hadn't really davened in regularly before. And in the shul, it's a shul that has its own library with some older sefarim, and plus there were some sefarim maybe from a nearby library that had been dropped off in the shul. So sefer rolled into my hand. I picked it up, and I see an interesting sefer. I hadn't recalled running into it before. The sefer is called Mecholas HaMachanoyim. And you could see that the shower blot, it's an old sefer. If you find it reproduced today, I don't know if it's for sale anymore, but maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago, Post-war, it was very common, very popular to reproduce Sfarim photomechanically. So it was very common to see Sfarim that had a much older look to them that had been reproduced. Today, that's already pretty much a market that's evaporated. Either you retype it or you don't bother at all. But the sefer itself was clearly 40, 50 years old, and it itself is based on a sefer from back in Hungary. So I'll tell you what the Sharblat says. The Sharblat says, Sefer Shilos Hatshuvas Mechelas HaMachanoyim Mevares Plagas HaNohar Ha'over Bein HaMachanoyim Menhage Batiknisiyas HaChadashim HaYeshanim Inyan HaModas HaBima VaChupa Okriya Sefer Torah V'Chadumeyan Al Kol Minig Uminig Poyel Tachlis Chomer V'Tzura Lakatati Amorim Bein HaBesarim Mipi Seifrim Umin HaSvarim Ve'ela HaDvarim Yachtav Mechubarim Min HaKatan Sheba Adarim Yisroel Dovid ben Harabani Mordechai Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger Hanikra Dovid Sered. Bala Machaber Sefer Chazayin Lamoyed Al Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh Yom Tov Sheni Ha'oim and Ala Mishmeres in Kehilas Pezing. So this is our Rabbi Yisroel Dovid of Pezing, and he has a Sefer Mechelas HaMachanoyim, and it's about this division and these arguments and debates over the Menhagim and Shul, the old ones, the new ones, the Bima, the Chuppah, Kriya. And this sefer, this chibur is going to focus on these questions. And the sefer is from the year Acharis. So Acharis is Taf Reish Yud Ches plus Al Taf Reish Yud Tes. So that is 3 years after the tshuva of Maram Shik. So the timeline stems. Apparently in Taf Reish Yud Vav, Taf Reish Tezayim, Yisroel Dovid of Pezing had been working on this chibur, and he sent it in manuscript to Maram Shik for review, for comment. And within 3 years, it had been printed, published, released into the world. So this sefer Taka, this sefer that I ran into last year, is Taka, the sefer in question over here. Why is it? Where does the lashon of the name of the sefer come from? Mechelas HaMachanoyim. It's a lashon of pasuk in Shir Hashirim. Shuvi shuvi ashulamis, shuvi shuvi v'nech zebach, matech zu bashulamis kemechelas HaMachanoyim. Whatever the taich is there. But he's using it in the sense of the machanoyim, that the camps, there's the division among Jewry, particularly in Hungary, where the Rav is a Mechaber. Pezing is today in Slovakia, but all in that general region. What else do we know about this Mechaber? So he does actually have a Hebrew Wikipedia article, pretty small. And the name of the entry is Yisroel Dovid Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger. So Nish Genug. On the Sharblat, he has a hyphenated double last name, Margulies-Jaffe, but on Wikipedia it's Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger, so triple hyphenated last name. I didn't go digging too deeply into where all the names come from, but the Jaffe he mentions there or elsewhere, he's an Einikol of the Levush. So it's Einikol of the Levush, so that's the Jaffe, and then Margulies and Schlesinger, Mustama are also other Choshev names. And back then there was a tkufa where if you came from Yichus and you wanted to flaunt your Yichus, so one way of doing it is you can have a nice letterhead, stationery, and write that you're a descendant of Kach v'Kach v'Kach, or you could cram it all into your name, and you can have a multiple hyphenated name. I think Lahavdil, you find that some of the royals in Europe also do something like that. So this was the trend at the time. Although I didn't see where he uses the name Schlesinger. Again, I didn't dig too deeply into it. But in the short of it is, he was born in Tov Samach Beis 1802, and he passed away Tov Reish Chav Daled 1864. So not an especially long life, but he made it to 62. And he was born in Hungary, and he learned in the yeshivas in Hungary. He learned by the Chassam Sefer, and it seems like the Chuvas of the Chassam Sefer to him as well. And he was a Rav in Semnitz, and then a Rav in Pezing, which is in Slovakia today, and that's where he passed away. That's where he's buried. And the article gives special mention to his chibur Mechelas HaMachanoyim, and they link to it and to other chiburim of his as well. He also has a nice thread on Eivelt about him. If you're familiar with the Yiddish forum, they tend to have threads about Chashavei Rabbanim, especially of the Hungarian background or those from those circles. An interesting footnote is that if you notice that he's referred to as Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger, So if you think about it, you pay attention, you realize that there are Rabbanim today with the last name Jaffe-Schlesinger, and one of them in particular has become something of an online star, Avram Jaffe-Schlesinger, the Baal Be'er Sorim, former Rav in Geneva. So lately he's had a number of viral breakout videos where he gives shiurim and he gets excited, he gets worked up, he screams at people in the audience, Lebedik. He has some interesting tenuas, interesting modes of expression that sound like they feel like a throwback, something of the past. It's a chiddush to hear and to experience it today. So at any rate, his name is Taka Jaffe-Schlesinger, and he's Taka an Einikel Ben Acher Ben of this Rav, and it's a branch of Rabbanim with Taka with Yichus. So just an interesting tie-in. In case you haven't heard of the Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger, maybe you heard of Avram Jaffe-Schlesinger, his Einikel. But back to the Mechaber, Yisroel Dovid. This Yisroel Dovid, if you search through the Sfarim of Maram Shik, you'll see that there are a number of tshuvas from Maram Shik to him. It seems like they were fairly close, and they were in touch a lot in Yonei Halacha. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Tafshin Ayin, they also printed a sefer Igris Maram Shik, other correspondence from the world of Maram Shik. And if you search his name there, you'll see his name comes up a number of times, and there are Mitzayin there as well, to all the places in the Shut Maram Shik where his name comes up. So that's just by way of a little background about this Mechaber, Rabbi Yisroel Dovid Pezing. Now I want to focus a little bit taka on the sefer itself, because when I saw the sefer last year, it stuck out not just out the Sharblat and the premise, but if you start flipping through the sefer, you start bletling through the sefer, you'll see that the Mechaber is quite an interesting fellow, and he writes in quite an interesting style. There's a little inkling of it on the Sharblat when he says that I'll call minig uminig poyel tachlis chomer v'tzura likat di amorim. So he has a very creative, out-of-the-box approach to discussing Menhagim. As we'll see, there is more of the concrete halachic stuff that Maram Shik was referring to, and some other stuff like that. But there's also a lot of colorful descriptions, quasi-philosophical, quasi-drush approaches to explaining the importance and the diuk of certain Menhagim. And he sort of seems to toggle and switch between them. The sefer itself has 3 different fonts. There's Rashi Yosef, and then there's small square letters and large square letters. An interesting little chibur. The official number of pages is 162 pages. I think the copy that I saw, the hard copy that I saw, was maybe just that. If you look on Yitzhak Chachma in Hebrew books, so there it's scanned together, maybe because it was bound together with a follow-up chibur that he had released afterwards called Har Tovar, which was a response to his sefer. So there's that as well. But here we're focusing just on the Mecholas Machanoim and what the sefer says, Maram Shik's response, and the influence of the sefer on these discussions, with a particular emphasis on this pasuk of Hisham Lecha Pantinokesh and Echa Yavdu, this nakuda of looking to them to learn, to copy how to worship Hashem. So we're obviously not going to go through all 162 pages, but I want to just give you a flavor, break down the number of simonim there are in there, not that many simonim, and just the general themes, the general topics, and his general points that are relevant to our discussion here. So he begins with Hakdama, and the point at the beginning of the Hakdama seems to be that when Chazal are Metak and Takanis and Menhagas, they're Mailim, they conceal the reason of the Takan and the Minhag, so you have no chance of trying to figure out what the reason is, and then to come and say, oh, well, the circumstances change, so things should change. Absolutely not. Kavana amuka ve'etza nechoina kisu v'helimu tamei atakanas v'menhagas. Once it's niskabel, it's enshrined. You can't overrule it. You can't override it. And yet we have this problem now. V'heinata v'veinesinur albim nefchu aleinu bahlois alu kimshoinim bekerem beis Yisroel, etc., etc. He writes fiyarech, flowery Hebrew for that time. But there's this big taina that Reiv Menhagi Yisroel, Nisyastu Mibalada Yisoid, the Menhagim don't have a Yisoid, and there's no point in keeping them. So he's responding, of course, to this big movement known overall as the Reform movement. And he describes how this has divided Klal Yisrael, particularly in that winkle of Europe. As we know, in Germany, Reform more or less swept most of what was in its path, but in Hungary, it was more of an even fight. And that's where the real fight happened, and was later we know it was known as the Teilung. And he uses that term already here in Hebrew informally, that there's a peleg, using this theme of machanoim, the camps. We have two camps. You have those that say, Hava nivnu lanu beis haknesses, uboy migdal. He's using some of the migdal terminology from the beginning of Sefer Bereshis. So, Hava nivnu lanu beis haknesses with a migdal, which is the bima, verdoishay b'ktzei mizrach, loy b'toicha emtza kasher banu aveseinu. And we can't hear about tefillah, the chazen's voice anymore in the traditional fashion. It has to be b'nigun hamurgol b'chol batei ha'amim. It has to be in the Gaesha fashion, with the nigun car, with the choir. And gam tzonif le'yitznef reishay, his head shouldn't be covered with the normal yarmulke, the normal head covering, but it should be a special four-cornered hat. And in that base knesset, that shul, that temple, that's where the chuppah should be, like all the other religions do it, inside, indoors, and not under the heavens. And during davening, they shouldn't shuckle, have to stand straight, and whoever screams Shema Yisroel out loud, he's in trouble, he gets kicked out. And V'shem Yisroel Yizachar Oid, we're not going to call people up to Aliyas anymore with their names. Holchu v'hisifu kirtzoinam lavatal kamam and hagi Yisroel. And the examples that he gives here are foreshadowing the topics and the focus in the Guf HaChibur further on. These are the topics that he is particularly hung up on. So he says, okay, there's a big tumult. This is the Na'arim, the young people, they're pushing, and let's see, should we be doiche b'shtei yadayim or not? So Darashi chakarti chipasti heitiv, and I saw these are dvarim that are noigim barumish shel olam yisodi ha'torah v'ha'emunah, and if you're mevatel them, it's b'zoy and hadas lata davar dezara chas v'shalom, and we can't negotiate, we can't give in, it's non-negotiable. And less than a page later, he circles back around to express, is this what Yiddishkeit has come to? The changing the neginois, and changing the koiva, the head covering, to square, to four corners. Is this going to strengthen Adas Yisrael if they do this new thing where they take the girls when they're 12, and they bring them to the temple, and they do this confirmation? Is that to say that the Shavuos Har Sinai isn't good enough? We need a new Shavuot to swear and do this confirmation ceremony. They don't stop at that because they seem to have a problem with the marriages also. We weren't doing the chuppah the right way until now. It needs to be in the shul, and where's the oath? Chassan and Kala didn't swear an oath to each other. They need to hold hands and swear an oath of loyalty to each other. And that itself is being mechal mikdash Hashem, gili arayas, the Chassan touching the Kala. With these great Averis, they claim that they're making Judaism stronger, they're improving Judaism. So that gives you a sense of the Akdama. There's more there, and like I said, he switches between speaking practice, and then he'll go off into semi-philosophical language and terminology. But he concludes the Akdama and he says, to explain the tam for Roiv Minhagi Yisrael, the ones that are contentious, the ones that are controversial currently at that time, and that's why he called them Mecheles HaMachanoim. We're going to clarify the two camps, one against the other, and he quotes the pasuk Mishir Hashem and explains why he's using that pasuk taka. And one of the reasons he mentions, point he emphasizes, is that Machel means a circle. He writes, Mechoiga Hanikres Tzirkel. And this mechaber, as he alluded to somewhat on the Showerblatt, and as we see throughout the Schibur, he had a geschmack and a koch in astronomy and geometry, and he goes off into these tchumim in interesting ways to try to create a justification and the basis and explanation for different minhagim. So he uses these geometrical terms to say that the mitzvahs have this geometrical aspect to them, that there's a center and there's a circle. So that's the kind of stuff that's part of the Chibur as well. We're not going to focus on that too much, but that's also alluded to in the name, the title of the sefer, Mecholas HaMachanoim. At the end of the Akdama, he signs his name. A cotton should be Yisroel Shmoy, Yisroel Dovid, Ben Haraboni, Manina Rav Mordechai Margulies-Jaffe, Mizera, Bala Machabe Sefer Halavushim Zal. And he mentions his mother's name as well. His mother, Imi Merasi Atznu Vachasuda, Maras Gittel, Mizer Maram Prague. And he is Ha'emet Ala Mishmaras in Pezing, B'Medinas Hagar in Hungary. Bala Machaber Sefer Chazayin Lamoy, Lechus Kodesh HaChodesh, Yom Tov Sheni. So this sefer, like I said, it's not so big. The sefer is broken into 8 simonim. And Siman Aleph is the one that's most relevant to our discussion here, the pasuk in Parsha today, which Maram Shik was responding to. So Siman Aleph, the premise is, Boy mevoyer kama loisase chayv hamadam b'avodas Yisroel l'shori hadasos be'eze minig v'nimos malbish oy nigun. So without getting even into the specifics of particular shinuyim, let's speak more generally. If your kavana is to mimic, to imitate, to adapt what the shori hadasos are doing, how usher is that? Like, how bad is doing that? And the way he sets up these simanim is that each siman is preceded by she'elas na'arim, where kaviyachol he's speaking for the new generation and representing their taina, speaking in their voice. So it begins, Shimu zeis haskenim, ma havoida zeis lachem. Why does nothing ever change? Everything has to stay the same. And doesn't the Torah say, Ki chachmaschem uvinaschem le'enei ha'amim va'omru rak am chochem v'novein hagoy hagadol hazeh. Our praise comes from the other nations. Hashem wants to hear the other nations praise us, and they're going to say that we're an am chacham v'novein. And how can we make that happen? How can we make that a reality? If we adapt our dasi torasenu minhagenu b'chol ha'afsher to be similar to theirs, so then ach bezois neis lanu lias l'teferes beineim. Now they're going to be happy and they're going to be proud of us and they're going to be impressed with us. And we're talking about Menhagi Yisroel Shlei Niskuru B'Torah. So, for example, the Bima Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger Yisroel Be'emtza Beis HaKnesses. Of course, not everyone that's listening necessarily even davens and grew up around a traditional Beis Knesses built in the old modes of building Bati Knesses, and that's a point I do want to get back to at some point. But we're talking about back then the conventional big community shul that tended to be built in a specific way, and it seems like it was reasonable to make a general statement and say that Rogali is Eitz Yisrael be'emtza Beis HaKnesses, but Eitz Kol HaDasos, the bima is in the front. So Halei Toiv L'Shanas HaDavar Hazeh La'amen HaBima B'Ktzei HaMizrach, and the Niguni HaTfilas, it should be B'Nigun Kar, let it be with a choir. And we should have Shneim Asr Na'arim Eitz L'Chazan, there should be 12 boys next to the Chazan. Maybe the next step is we can get an orgel, we can get the organ to play music during the tefillah like the other dasas do. Now maybe we haven't fully gotten there yet for now, but at least for now, let's get the chazan a hat, a square hat. Without that, lo yeshama b'voy el hakodesh. So that way, if their ministers, their sadim, their nobles, their leaders, they visit our shul, they'll say, wow, amazing, we're all on the same page, we all do the same thing. And also, what about the chuppah? Why is it outside, not inside? And why do they call people up, Yamoid, Pliny Ben Pliny, to the Torah and to the chuppah? No one else does that. They don't call them up by name and say, so-and-so come up to do X, Y, and Z. And we've heard that there are a number of kehillas that have been making these changes, so we also want to do this. Listen to us. So that's Atkan HaShaila, representing their voice of their taina. So he responds and he says, I hear what you're saying, and I looked into it, but you have it all backwards. The idea that we should change Nimusi HaTorah to come closer to Nimusi HaMedinas, that's the Am Chacham B'Navim. No, the whole shaveh, the whole praise of our Torah is that there's no chiluf and there's no tmura, it's unchanging, that's the biggest proof that the Torah is emes, etc. And he continues in this vein for a few pages, and then a few pages later, Zayin Amud Beis, or page 16 in Eitzer HaChachma, he gets to the point that we are particularly interested in. This question, V'omnam ata novoya lachkar laklal kuloi be'inyan isser hasheni, dahainu shafilu lo yeh b'minhagan ha'elu shom inyan. Let's say the minhagan themselves, there was nothing too important about them. Im he masurim l'shanoisa mipnei isser is damos b'das Yisroel l'sh'arei ha'dasis uchmesh yizbar lefanenu be'esas Hashem. V'noimar. And that's the question, and this is what we're going to say. Da, you should know that if you serve Hashem b'chol liboy, however, in the process of doing so, who oised nimus or inyan, in your avodah, in an oifen sheyavdu sh'orei bali hadasis, oiver al kama v'kama lo yisaseh shabbater. This is the yisoid that he came up with, and that's the yisoid that we saw Maram Shik quoting back and saying, you're correct, you're absolutely correct. So it's kama v'kama, it says it's no less than 7. The Zemis Spartam, what's the first one? Ksiv Parsha today, Hisham l'chopantina kashachadeyem ufentidrish leleheim lemor eicha yavdu agayim ma'elas aleheim ve'esa ken gamoni loisas ken lashem lekecha. Just the beginning of the next pasuk. The Kosev Haramban ala Torah, that it means shafil lashem lekei Yisroel asra Torah lanu avoida asher tiyeh al oifen sheyavdu shor ha'amim b'das shalahem. And that's the pshat. Pentidrish eicha yavdu hema. How do they serve their God? Asa ken gamoni tuhu lashem lekei Yisroel. So me'ata hareza arba leisa. So you're right there. You have four. Because side the lashon hishamer, inside the lashon of pen is a leisase. So it says hishamer lecha, that's one. Pen tinakesh, that's two. Upen tidresh, that's three. Leisasekein is four. So you have four leisases right there in 1.5 psukim. Then he goes on, he says, okay, according to Rashi, that's not how Rashi teaches it, but even according to Rashi, so we have another pasuk in Parsha Shoftim, and he goes on, we're not going to delve too deeply into it. I just wanted to build up to where he made that point that we were especially interested in and concerned with. And a bit later, a bit further there, he says, V'nira, that the Rambam and his chibur seems to hold like Ramban here on this question. Because in Hilchas Akum, Hilchas Avidah Perkei Aleph, it says, Ein hochen b'chukas ha'akum, b'chukas ha'goyim, l'mizdamen lehem, shenamar, v'leisilchu b'chukas, v'namar, v'chukas hem leisalechu. And the Rambam adds, V'namar, pen tinokesh achareim, this pasuk number 8. So we see that hitaka taichas pen tinokesh bim izdame. That's not that you're serving a very desire, but that you're adopting or adapting their modes of behavior into some kind of Jewish context to Kedas and Ramban, the lake Kedas Rashi. The Oid Mavur came with Varov, Perek Beis Lacha Beis, because it says there, Zelishoyna Upen Tidrish Aleheim, Lemur Echa Yavdu, Shalei Tishal, Derech Aveda Echu, Afabisha Ein Ata Oivda. There the Rambam is making a slightly different point, which is that you shouldn't take an interest, you shouldn't be curious, you shouldn't want to study their modes of Aveda. But the Mechaber of this Chibur feels that that's closer, more in line with Ramban than with Rashi. So you're not serving a very desire. Then he says, "V'ninovi raya brutal adas Rambam, Rambam and asafri muva b'yalkut parsha today upented shalehem leimar chayavdu shalei toimer hoil v'nyetz bargamon afani yetz bargamon etc." Which Maram Shik Taka quoted back, Bekitzer, as we began with. So we see that the Sifri is also going in this Mahalach, doesn't mention a very desire, so it's L'chayret Fakert, to serve Hashem using their Malbush, using their Argamon, the Alderech Sha'ovdin, Sha'ari Hadasis, Ukadas Harambam. So Me'at Mavur, that let's say this hat that he's very upset about, or Niggin, or Malbush, all of these kinds of things, I believe he's referring back to the contemporary ones that he's referring to. Kulam chayav maleim kama v'kama malchus mid'oraisa. El shadas Rashi, it's the other pasuk. Ol hilchsa Rambam b'Ramban b'Sifri chayav maleim kama v'kama malchus. And l'chayda, even in the Tzuras Beis HaKnesses, the Beis HaTefillah, if we come to copy and to imitate, is a chayav malchus. Because another example in the Rambam is v'liyivnu mekoyim kibinyan hechalas shel akum k'meishem oisim areza leka. So you get malchus on the individual for the individual who wears a certain malbush, but also for the binyan Beis HaKnesses. So in his model and his framework, changing the bima or making these other shinuyim would be al derech that I'm saying, building a binyan kebinyan echalas shel avodah zarah. So as far as he's concerned, he's essentially proved his central premise, which is the premise of the entire Chibur, really. Although in the individual minhagim, he's going to try to demonstrate how each minhag is taka meduyik, and therefore if you're mashana, you're being mekalkel. But before you get into any of that, as he explained, lu yitzuyir, there was no good reason. Just the atzem changing it, l'shem change, l'shem imitation, would be over, and it would be for these reasons. So he's articulated the sort of the first line of defense against any change based on this yisur that he's articulated. The problem with this is, and we'll get back to this point a few times, is that l'chayra, not everyone who's making shinuyim is making it necessarily for the exact same reason. Maybe until now, no one ever changed the format of the shul because things were frozen in place. Now that the conversation has begun about, hey, you know what, maybe we don't have to build the shul exactly the same way. Maybe we can introduce architectural change. So maybe there are other reasons why people want to make changes, and maybe they want a different design. Maybe yoifi, or they need room. They feel like the bima, let's say in the middle, is taking up room that they could otherwise use. especially if if the minhag was that there was no spaces to sit from the bima all the way to the aron, or maybe even from the back all the way to the bima. So if you put the bima all the way in the front, so then you have more seating space. There could be other practical reasons. So here, a few pages later, he's trying to make the case that, well, one point he makes is that you're following in the path of those who are oikrim and misdamim and choinfim, harishainim. They're the ones who made the first tailing division. So now, even if you make the change for other reasons, but you're following in their path, so it's still the same deal. Then he makes this point that could be taka that not all the psukim, especially the psukim that we started with, pentinokish. The whole word is echayavdu. Your whole expression is, I want a copy. So what if you're not? That's not your mindset. That's not your conscious mindset. So can taka zay maybe that those psukim taka wouldn't apply to someone like that, but the other psukim, the matzevo, v'chukeseyem, you would be over on those lavin, even if you're not mechavan les dames, and that's where the sugya starts getting a little bit into the weeds. But that's the punchline. That's the bottom line of the argument he tries to make here. Then he throws in another line that even if you claim your mom is doing it, no connection, any mechavan les dames, but you can't deny that maris ayin the nira de mistame ikke sharei be'ene gedorli Yisroel nira hadavar ahu sheba les dames. Who decides whether you're imitating or whether it looks like you're imitating? The Gedolei Yisrael see it as seeking to imitate, which is an interesting point because often Maris Ayin is sort of understood to mean that someone who doesn't know the full picture might make a mistake. So he says Lo Yugra Maris Ayin Eni Yisrael Hagdoilim Min Maris Ayin Shal Yoshvei Kronos. So you can come and say no, it's not our kavana, but the Gedolei Yisrael, they're suspecting you. There's the Maris Ayin. So even if it just looks like your kavanas list damas, so it's maris ayin of the lav of pentinokish and all the other lavin of echayavdu, etc. He continues a bit in this vein. He fears zoyis ken kachadin al filmi she'en kavanas list damas mikomakim movad shu'ever al kam v'kam aleisas ekamei matzeva v'chadoyma. He argued earlier that you're over in other lavin regardless. Oid boy chumra yoyser shu maris ayin deninam is dame. So if it's tzarech lizbro sakanas nafashis karav lemisa v'leyaver lasas maris ayin hazeh. So according to him, it's kamat, yarig vayaver. Then he says, okay, now we have to back up a little bit. Tzicha and achna laman is a schos al hador. They shouldn't be chas v'shalom ba'inish yarig vayaver. So even though we can't save them from the malchus, let's save them from the yarig vayaver. So now we'll bring a raya to the paiskim that if it's just avizrayu the vaytizara, then yav vayarig. So let's say that this is lizdamis is only avizrayu. So technically, if you were put to the test of whether you should allow yourself to be killed, okay, you're not over. Not that anyone necessarily had that nisayan, but you're not being nichshel in a yaharik v'layaver. And with this, more or less, he's satisfied. On the one hand, he drew the line in the sand. It's non-negotiable. It's karav to yaharik v'layaver. Okay, you want me to be melamed schos? That's not completely yaharik v'layaver. Fine. So I feel even a little benevolent that I was matzel you from that avera. After that, he says, so they're gonna turn to us and they're gonna say, who's causing the haflaga? Who's causing the tailung? It's the Rabbanim Askeinim. You don't want to listen to us. So our response will be, we can't listen to you because we hold that you're being over on kama v'kama leisa, say it's kamat yorik bal yaver. So, and for us to ignore our own opinion, ein lecha megunam and adam she'ever al achros v'das atzbay. If you're not morally consistent, you're a hypocrite. If that's what we truly believe, then there's nothing to talk about. However, we ask them, why are you trying to make machlekas imputed? You're the ones who are causing machlekas. And that itself is a big avera. Why do you feel comfortable with making such a machlekas and a pirud? And he comes and says an interesting vart. I'll share it because he quotes his Rabbi the Chassam sefer. He says at the end of the vidui on Yom Kippur, we say, v'loi shaveh lanu. He says, what's taich v'loi shaveh lanu? What's the vidui of v'loi shaveh lanu? And why is that the conclusion of the vidui? The Seder vidui is, you start with hakal tchila, and then you get to the averes achamudas b'soif, and all the way at the end we say v'loi shaveh lanu. That must be the worst avera. The worst avera must be v'loi shaveh lanu. What's das? So Shemati b'pi moedi maharmas zal surely is Moshe Sefer zal. For who he says the taich the Chassam Sefer says is that someone who does an avera but there's episa hana. So he can come and he can verantworten sich to the Eibishter, the look, the hana, the taiva caused me to be over and it blinded me. But if you're chayta in something that's not shaveh, it's not worth anything, so then has garnish kentaina to be saved from your terrible einish. And he says this is also taichin pasuk. The pasuk says, "Shtayim rois osu ami oisi ozvu mekarmayim chayim lachtzif lahem boides nishbarim." There's two things. They abandoned me, the source of the mayim chayim, and they dug boides nishbarim. He says that's talking the two things. Number one, you left me, okay? You left me. At least show me that you went to accomplish something you thought you're going to accomplish, a tachlis, but instead you abandoned the Eibishter. And chatz v'lehem boides nishbarim, it's shaveh. So it's a rock fuller. So the vidui is based on this word. Sign mitzvah sacha toivim, that's the mekar mayim chayim. And not just that, but we went and we did averis, asher gam lanu, ein shaveh klum. It's nicht wert garnish, le tachlis, le hanov, le tainug. That's the worst avera of all. That's why it fits at the end. It should say it b'soif, the chait of v'lei shaveh lanu, hi achamura shebekulam. So Ervil Tainen, that's the case over here. He says, think about all these shinuyim and this big division that you're creating. Eze hano yesh la'adam izeh. V'chima ichbas l'cha minagin achasim kazeh, or kazeh, hal mi'albish begadim ka'ela, if Harem HaKadosh Li is in the shul or in the chotzer, or if the bim is here or there. Tell me, there's no room. The bim pasha, there's no room for davening. Our zaydis, they always went to shul, they had room, and all of a sudden you don't have room. So, there's no real reason. Stam machlekes, for the sake of machlekes, that's his interpretation. That's his counter argument. And as we saw, he's sort of throwing the argument back at them. The young chavra, they're claiming that the old rabbanim, they're the difficult ones. They're the ones that are causing the separation, the division. So he's throwing it back and saying, actually, you're the ones doing it, and you have no reason to be doing it. It's mamish, garnished for no reason. And that, more or less, is the thrust of Siman Aleph. Siman Beis is Lama ein anachnu yochelim lachlik al bali atalmud. Why we can't argue on the Gemara. That's a whole additional sugya. It's also a more klolistic sugya, and it's the type of stuff that Chassam Sofer himself was already dealing with. And of course, we can say generally that this mechaber is being hoilich b'darkei shel Chassam Sofer to sort of find stronger halachic frameworks and basis for things that were sort of taken for granted until then. More recently, I argued that the Tzemach Tzedek was also doing a version of that for a certain inyanim, but the Russian government was challenging in Russia. So this was an era, the early 1800s was an era where you find this genre of halachic writing where certain justifications for individual minhagim, but also larger frameworks that sort of establish that minhagim can't be tampered with, and whether it's coming from top down from the government or whether it's coming from those from within who are looking for change. And like I said, sort of drawing the line in the sand and saying, Ad kan, there's no room for negotiation, we can't budge. So Siman Beis gets into that whole sugya, that big sugya of what's the toikif of the Hachrois and the Gemara. Siman Gimel is Chaymer Isser Mavatul Minig. So those are the more general inyanim. And then the rest, the other 5 simanim, are more specifically where he's going to argue that it's not just minig for the sake of minig and no change for the sake of no change, but take adrab, I'll fight you in every single minig and I'll explain to you why it's bedafka. So Siman Dalet is Zayin Taimim on the Sinas HaChuppah Tachas HaShemayim V'lev Beis HaKnesses. 7 reasons why the chuppah has to be taka under the heavens, not in the shul. Just to give you a taste of flavor, he starts off and says, what are the 7, he says the 7 times, the 7 Yisoidus. Number 1, Torah Shebeksav. Number 2, Din Shulchan Aruch. Number 3, Nimusi HaTorah v'Hamedinius. Number 4, Chochmas HaTeva, science. Number 5, Chochmas Hiluch HaMazolos, based on astrology. Number 6, Chochmas HaTchuna, astronomy. And number 7, Das Chachmei HaMechakrim, philosophy, or something like that. But you're going to have to be eyeing yourself to get the full experience and to get your full enjoyment out of that. Siman Hey, Asher Inyan Bima Ba'emtza Hu Yisoid, Asher Kemat Kol HaTorah Kula B'nuya Olav, V'ha'oikre Min HaEmtza, Oikre Yisoidi HaTorah. It's like pulling out the foundation of Gans Yiddishkeit, which he already foreshadowed, alluded to at the end of his Akdama. He's going to use geometry and ideas of that nature to make the case that the Bima Mamish needs to be in the middle. And along the way, he throws in his favorite framework of Tachlis, Chomer, Tsura, and Poyel to explain all the stadim of the importance of the Inyan. Siman Vav, and this stood out for me when I saw the sefer last year, and I think when I opened it, I actually was momentarily confused. Siman Vav is Chomer Isser Shel Halevish Koiva Merubas B'Shas HaTfila Davka V'Inyan Mishaloshin B'Meruboin V'Kama Chakidas Gedoyles V'Amukos. How terrible an Isser it is to wear a square head covering during davening, and the union of triangles and squares and other great chakiras. And he goes on this topic, I kid you not, for around 35 pages. And Nishtam, it goes off in the middle. There's geometry. Somewhere along the way, there's a picture of like a telescope illustrating some tangential point he's making. I actually just shared it a day before I recorded this. I shared an image of that page, and I asked, can anyone guess how the Mechaber got to this image, got to this inyan? What topic did he get there from? The answer being, he got there from square yarmulkes. Now this square yarmulke thing is not, when you think of reform and the controversies, somehow it doesn't rank as high as the other ones, which is why it's so interesting that it was so aggravating to him. And like I said, when I saw the sefer last year, I was momentarily confused. I was wondering if the sefer was serious, or is there some kind of satirical, some kind of parody going on here? But no, apparently he meant it very seriously. And I guess he had to be there, and the introduction of this type of garb could have been disturbing. Interestingly, of all the chidushim and shinuyim, this chidush is sort of still with us till today. If you look at the upper class, the higher class of professional chazanim, often professional chazanim, even charedim, even with the beard and payas, Amal, someone with a beard, Lavdafka, was fully Haredi or fully Shemer Torah mitzvahs 100 years ago. It's hard to know, but today you have people that clearly identify as Haredi, and yet there is this levush, this tolboshet, this outfit of the chazim that's still around till today that only chazanim wear. And one of the things that you notice is the hat. They have this interesting hat, which Mistama itself, I don't know if they're all identical or they're different versions of it. There's a more, I think, mitznefistic looking one, but maybe some of them are just sort of a large square. And apparently that levush of the chazan dates back to this period where the reform-inclined shoals, or the shoals that were looking for change, to be up to date, updated the garb of the chazan to look like this, and apparently it was understood at the time to be some kind of imitation of what was going on, lahavdil, in the churches. So to him, this was equally a crime as all the rest, and he tackles it in his inimitable way. He begins by pointing out that Be'emes Yavazam Musig in Maseches Megillah, this idea of someone who stands Oimid Lefnei HaTeva, and there's a question about the clothing he's wearing, Tzvuin versus Belavanim, Layaver, Shem Nizruka Boiminus. So there is this idea all the way back to Chazal, and you have in Shulchan Aruch about using the wrong Nagunim, if you use the Nagunim from the other religions, Mavina Moisoi. So Ebazoi, this koiva, you know where this koiva comes from, and he claims that the koiva is based on the Shsiva Erev. So Chazan Ayakala Shiakpidu, Lubish Dafka Begikazeh, so same din of the Mishnah. But that's just the opening salvo, and like I said, he goes at it with a tremendous arichas. And the big theme for him is the theme of threes in the Torah. The three, everything in Torah has to be three brachas, three tkiyas, three kedushas. And four is pirud, misham yeparid v'hayal arba roshem. And even the things in Torah that are four, you see that they're comprised of threes. So there are four degalim, but each one has three shvatim. Or the chayshin is ravua, but it has three avonim in every row, etc. Now, a bit further on, he mentions an interesting point, which he he frames as sort of a response to the lag. They were mocking the Minhag Yisroel of how they call people up to the aliyas. So apparently, they would call people up for shlishi and for shvi. The chazan, the person calling those people up, would make an extra task for the shlishi and the shvi. That's what it sounds like. Can't say I'm personally familiar with that, but okay, makes sense. So he says they're making fun of the shlishi and the shvi. So adrabah, to him, this is the whole nekuda of everything he's trying to say. It's the numerology, and he says, before I answer you, or before you want to start laughing at that, I have a much bigger kasha. The Minhag Yisrael Yom Kippur Seder Avodah, which is the biggest tefillah, and the Shalma Farim Sefasenu. So what's the Minhag Nagu B'chol Tfutzis Yisrael? I don't know if the Sfardim do it or just the Ashkenazim, but all the Ashkenazim at least. At the Chazan and the Kol, Machan Arash, Ashturim, when it comes to counting the Hazoyas, Achas Lamayla, V'Shav Lamata, and the Chazan screams, V'Chach Hayamoyne, Achas, until Achas V'Shava, and the Olam is also storming. So v'lo neida mayish b'zeh ha'inyan. What's it's not even the Shalma Fanim Sifasenu. There's no mitzvah to the counting. The counting is just that you should halt cup and not make a mistake. And if you do the hazah and you don't count, it's kosher l'kol yama. Just don't, as long as you don't make the error. Why are we shtorming and being maflik with minyan hazeh 3 times? So to him, this is just his introduction to more tremendous arichas on his model of numbers, numerology. But I think the bottom line, after many, many pages, is this idea of that the number 3 and the number 7, so they were mocking the Shlishi and the Shvi, and here they count, in Shul, they count to 7 3 times, and how 3 and 7 are somehow the cornerstone, the Yisroel of ganz Yiddishkeit, so it all works out, and it all stems, and everything's bediuk. And back to the Yarmulke, this idea of 3 corners versus 4 corners, so right through this whole mahalach, that 3 is good and 4 is bad, and you have Dalad Misses, and you have Dalad Avois Nazikin, and Dalad Yedias Hatuma, and the Dalad Shvur Sheker, and the Maris Nagoyim, Yitzias HaShabbos, all these lists in Mishnayos, so all the 4s, they're all bad. But further on, he actually touches on something that there's something from the Rebbe on a letter somewhere about Ein Meruba Mesheshus Mebreshus. So he says the only thing that you find that's square is that B'Shir Hanega we say it's Kigris Kilki Meruba. We've done shiurim on the gris, and that's a whole topic of an answer, but there's this lashon gris kilki meruba. He says you don't find anywhere else, not a peir, not a balchai, that's meruba, only the gris. The gris is the only thing that's meruba. And he mentions this Yishalmi Maisres, that ein meruba mamesh misheshus mebreshus, so tying all these makaidas together to make the case against the 4, against the square. At some point he goes off into the minig of the egois in Rosh Hashanah, that we don't need egois. Egois is begamatria chet, but it's only begamatria chet without the aleph. So it's very shver. Let's eat the egois because egois is begamatria toiv mole. Why make a gematria to chet chaser? Make a gematria to toiv mole. And this itself shows you how these ramazim and these minhagim, it's not pasha, it's not simple balabatish logic. There's something deeper. You have to understand what the egois represents. Interestingly, in a footnote, after he has his mahalach, he writes in the footnote, Matzasi ken lahedja b'sefer vayakol Moshe. So we were just talking about the sefer vayakol Moshe in the previous installment. We were talking about the Shmuel b'shem Narizal, about Shmadis. So it's interesting to see the sefer suddenly crop up again. Kayadua, that once you discover something rare and unusual, you start noticing it in more places. And he says he also heard from his Rebbe, Maharas, surely again, the Chassam Sefer, who also what his mahalach was when he was nizer, when he wasn't nizer, in this minig of the egoism. And towards the end of the siman, he sums it up, and you could say this siman, even though the premise seems a little funny to our ears, to our eyes today, but this was sort of his magnum opus on his whole mahalach, his whole approach to creating a framework for understanding minhagim and the small minhagim that come down to questions of numbers. So this was to him very wichtig. And he sort of summarizes, gives the roundup of all the highlights of all the things he touched on in this siman. Kol minig Yisroel ze chachma nefla, gam tzakas v'rasha kol v'achaz minyan shvi, u'minyan hazoyes b'yom kippur, and the pizman ki yanei kachomer, and minias achilas egas b'rosh Hashanah, and the number 3 and the number 7, masha enkin, the square, the meruba, that's, you got to watch out for that unless it contains 3s. Like the Tfilas HaTfilin, or the Dalad Degalim, or the Ma'aseh HaChoshen. So here's where he sums up his Torah of the numbers. This Vart, that 4 represents Pirud, Misham Yiparid, B'Hayala Ba'arashim, and by Tzias HaShabbos, to be Yotzim, Rishus HaYachid, Yechidah Shel Olam, to Rishus HaRabim, and that was the Chet Egel. They were Nikshol and the Arba Panim of the Pnei Ashar, and the Arba Vis Nazikin, and the Dalat Karnas HaMizbeach, Atui Machaper, and the Karnei Ashar, etc., etc. Again, he sort of recaps all of his Gedanken and how he ties them and threads them all together. And he still has 2 Simanim to go. Siman Zayin is Gerdel Chet HaMalag, the Galamedim Koile Betfila, V'Kolshkin, Alamedim Koile B'Hal, V'Kriyashma. And Siman Ches is Chaymer HaIsser HaMavatel Kriya L'Sefer Torah B'Shem, this idea where they wanted to stop calling people up by their name to the Torah. What's taka the Malka, what's taka the Yisoid, but Chas v'Shalom to change that. We don't really have time to focus on that, but I'll just mention one point from the last siman. Is one point he mentions is that it's actually calling people up to the Torah is actually very important in Halacha, because often We probably have touched on it ourselves before. Questions of gittin, shemes gittin, and often that comes down to how is he called to the Torah. That was sort of the way to establish what a person's shem kodesh is, especially people who don't use their shem kodesh in their everyday. And he mentions, so for example, someone, they called him Yitzchak by the bris, but he signs his name and he's called by most people Ignatz. He's already using not an old traditional Ashkenazi name, but a more up-to-date name. So l'chayda Ignatz is Mamash's Iker name. However, the Shem Kodesh takes precedence because that's the name that you use to be oila to the Torah. That's what makes your Shem Kodesh the Iker Hashem. So we'll write in the get Yitzchak HaMechuna Ignatz. And if you write Ignatz HaMechuna Yitzchak, the get is possible. Amram calls that ish oila sefer Torah. But isha she'ena oila sefer Torah, they only do mishabeirach. So this taka pulpul bein hapaiskim. If it's simcha hamachuna fredel, so this vart that these Yiddish names did have a Hebrew name linked to them, and there was originally this idea of giving both. The problem is that the Hebrew name isn't used in the same way. So then what do you write in the get? You write simcha hamachuna fredel, or should you just write fredel the miskaya simcha? I'm Bezebesivin Kochavtes and the Beis Shmuel and the Lavush. And I'll add that we taka see Bechlal that among women, the idea of having a Shem Kodesh taka dropped off over time. A lot of women today only have a Yiddish name without a Shem Kodesh. To me, it seems a little funny and bothers me a little bit, but it's for this reason where you don't really have a use for a Shem Kodesh the way a man does. Mashenk a man, that's what determines that the man had this Hebrew name. But he says, Mela, that machlikas not happened by the women where they weren't signing their name necessarily at all, or they weren't using the Shem Choyel. But now today you have Chevra, they sign their name with the Shem Choyel, and everyone calls them by the Shem Choyel, and some people don't even know their Shem Kodesh, except for the Kriyas Sefer Torah. So when you drop that, you're mamish ruining the people's Jewish identity, and then when they're going to come to write a get, it's going to cause a great kilkel, and they're going to use the Shem Kodesh le'ikr, but really the original din was based on the fact that the Shem Kodesh had a certain ikr to it. But if you don't use it, then is the Shem Kodesh your ikr name anymore? You have this in America today all the time. You have people where when they pass away, they go dig up in the files and they find that, when he was born, the name, the Moel gave them a certificate and they said his Hebrew name is X, Y, and Z. If you what this Mechaber is saying, it's a little schwer to even consider what exactly their relationship with that name is. It's basically nishtaka and other types of scenarios where there was a shiloh over someone's name and a pisul and a get. The idea that the person had the name but no one ever used it couldn't mean that it's nishtaka. It's taka not their name anymore. So I don't know if any of these people with these names today are even getting gittin. That's usually today at this point. The tailung unfortunately has led to the fact that those who don't know the Hebrew name are probably not getting a get, although there could always be exceptions. But he's still talking about the matzav in his day where people, whether or not it was before or after the emancipation, but many more secular Jews were still getting their marriage and their get through the Jewish community, but then at some point you'll have these shilas talk about what their name is, and so they technically have a Shem Kodesh, but is it really taka their legal halachic name? So he says, and he writes this in huge square letters, so you see how a minute like this, everything's connected to each other. You pull out one link, you think, okay, who cares if we're going to call people up to the Torah or not, but by undermining that, downstream, all of a sudden you're passing gittin, or you're creating pasuk gittin, and you're being marbim mamzeden. So, I think it's a nice point that he's making, that you could see that's a nice example of how a small detail like that has bigger repercussions. And he writes there, he says, I was once asked by a kahila, they made a asu etzli shaila, they made a shaila by me, to tell him, a pidin Torah, is there an isser to be avato kriyal sefer Torah b'shem? And they told him, we're only asking if there's an isser. We don't care about chassidus. We don't care about minhagis. Tell us if it's mutter or is it aser. So he decided to give it back to them, be his darf design. So he said, you're coming with the shaila. And anyone who comes with the shaila in their mind, the mamash at tzaddik, I'm coming with the shaila. He says, you know what you remind me of? You remind me of Zimri ben Salu. Zimri ben Salu, when he came to be boiled at Aramis, it's like, I don't know if he's saying that he did come with a shaila, or would be like as if, imagine if he came to be boiled at Aramis, but he came and he asked to have a shaila first. By the way, is it asura or muteres? And says, by the way, I already said in the Akdama that it's Halacha Moshe Messina, that even in Mitzrayim, they're moved all meb'ilas ka'ela, so it's taruvas hayichos. So even on a sort of a pre-Torah yisoid, it would be poigim in the yichos, so it's would have been considered off limits. So when you come and ask me, is there a clear isser to be mevatel kriyas sefer b'shem? That's like Zimri ben Salu coming and asking his question, because the outcome is the same. The outcome is the same. The outcome is that's mevi lefamim lidei mamzerus b'Yisrael chas v'shalom. So v'asher b'zem meguna mamish k'moi she'elas Zimri ben Salu. And with that, more or less, he concludes his chibur, and at the end he throws in lizikaron for the neshama of his shviger, hagvira tzadekes moras yitl, and to his sister, the memory of his sister, tzadekes moras chayla, and in the memory of his daughter, Biti Abasula, moras edelzal, and a few other family members as well who are still living. And then at the end he writes his snatzlos, biggest snatzlos. What's this snatzlos? The snatzlos is hayois darkilos Yisroel, where the Rabbanim, Kadoshi Elyon, and yet they made some shinuyim in Minhag Yisroel. So what's the snatzlos? The snatzlos isn't I'm sorry if I was too sharp and you have chashuv Rabbanim, I don't want to mess with them. No, the snatzlos is you're gonna chas v'shalom think that those Rabbanim are responsible, and why weren't they mechiach them, and why didn't they leave their kehillah? But taka chalil liyas yad Rabbanim b'mal hazeh, and surely they taka made a macha. Efes, they did a lot of techaches, and it didn't help. Alluding to that lashon that we discussed previously. Because if they leave, then the person that's going to replace them is going to be much worse. Instead of a moida hara, they're going to have a moida hara chas v'shalom. So what does the Refa Aguf do when he sees that one aver of the body is finished? So you want to cut it off to save the rest of the guf. So kaneda, that's what these Rabbanim are doing. So he's making an apology on behalf of the Rabbanim that haven't quit, because they made the cheshbon that if they quit, it's going to be even worse. But chas v'shalom doesn't mean that any Rav supports any shir, any minhag whatsoever, and don't make that mistake. So that's his snatzlos. So that's the sefer that Maharam Shik was responding to. As we saw, the ikr that he was responding to was in Siman Aleph, but the second half of the sefer gets increasingly more interesting. Like we said, especially the siman on the yarmulke, the hat, and the pictures and illustrations and the geometry, very interesting and exciting. I should just point out that, as we saw, he has another chibur, Chazon Lamoed, on Inyanei Tchuna, so clearly he had a chush and a geschmack in these inyanim, so it seems like he blended his interests together, and in a way it's a maila, he's an interesting person. He's not just a kanoi that just screams kanos. He's a kanoi, but also he's a kanoi for tradition, but also out of the box, astronomy, astrology, and other stuff. Last year I mentioned I came across the sefer and I came across the siman and I found it interesting. So at the time I started looking to see, does anybody quote this discussion, such an extreme argument and fight, and saying that the square yarmulke is mamish isurim. I was curious to see if anybody quotes it anywhere, and I come out, didn't find anything. But then I found that the one chibur you would expect to quote a is Oitzer HaKippa by Rabbi Aryeh Dovid Wasserman, very contemporary sefer. So all the way in Chelik Beis, Perek Hey, which is on what the Shliach Tzibur wears, he has a shtickle section there about the Chazin's dress, and the fact that historically the Chazin's dress is imitating the Galachim, and it all was part of that Tanua, that initiative, that move to bring the Jewish aesthetics in line with the Christian aesthetics. And he surveys this, the history of this a little bit. He mentions that there was a maisa in Brisk, that at some point in Brisk, the Chazan came wearing a white one, and the Velvel screamed at him to take it off. And Taka there, he's malak at different svarim, Reb Chaim Palachi and others who discussed this. And he Taka is mitzayin to Mechelas Machanayim, Siman Vav, and he summarizes in a page or so just the very bottom line of the Mechelas Machanayim's tying on that, but I don't know if he reflects the absolute arichas that the Mechelas Machanayim goes on in discussing this issue. And Ayin Sham in Eitzer HaKippa for his overview. But like I said, it's interesting, and we'll get back to this general point a bit further on, that it's interesting that of all the shinuyim, this one seems to have stuck around the most, and even in very Haredi circles. Maybe not the Baal Tefillah in a Chassidish Rebbe Shul, but in some of the more formal, fancy shuls that are taka built, kamaskoines of the old fancy shuls of Amol. So even if the Chazan is a Haredi, even some of them are Chassidish, it does seem somewhat common to wear these types of levushim, even though they have these questionable origins. Now, we just mentioned brisk. It's interesting, B'chlal, to compare Hungary to further into Eastern Europe. We know the Yitzhak Kippur mentions, we'll get to it as well in a bit, that the Divrei Chaim was involved in the Yisurim in Hungary. But you go even further into Russia, and there were some similar shinuyim that were taking place. There definitely were modern shoals in the big cities, but it never fully kicked in as this schism, this tailung between Orthodox and Reform. It sort of happened in some kind of a different pattern. As we know that in Hungary also there was sort of the state religion, and there was a fight over the control of the state religion, and then until they split, and that was part of the notion behind the split. And Russia and Poland didn't quite go quite that way. That probably needs to be discussed and analyzed separately. But one element of this whole fight that we do hear about a little bit in Chabad is the Rebbe Rashab in the Rishimus of his relative Baruch Shneir, the Rishimus of the Bosch. There's this mention of how the Rebbe Rashab was avoiding shows that he knew were a chor shul, a choir shul. Shows that were set up with a choir, which itself is an interesting thing, because we do know that there was a musik of chazonim with meshorerim, even in very traditional shows in Eastern Europe. And recently it was chadash to me that even in Lubavitch, Rabbi the Chazan, who is like a more formal chazan, apparently would also take meshorerim from the Tamimim and Temcha Tamimim. But Kanera, there's a chiluk and a shinui between doing it in a more traditional way versus some mode which was much clearly imitating how the other religions did it. And that setup, that format, was known as a chor shul, and to Rabbi Rashab was davar pasha. You don't step foot in a chor shul. As to the sefer itself, as we'll see, it's not completely obscure. Those who are familiar with the topic of the reform and the response should be familiar with the sefer, but it's not a household name either. It's somewhere there in the middle. But if you start looking into it, you find that it is cited with some regularity depending where you look. Back to the Maram Shik. So Maram Shik began, we saw the Shul, Maram Shik said, I received your sefer in Ksav Yad, and I agree with your point about the Isser and this pasuk and Parsha today and all that. But then Maram Shik Taka responds and says, and this is like a weak point in the argument, what if they say they're not doing it Liz Damis? What if they say they're doing it Mishom Reva Hamakim? You wanted to tie into them. Maybe it's not Pentinakish, it's not Echayavdu, but it's still B'chukasem Leiselechu. And Maram Shik says it's not so pasha, because it says in Shulchan Aruch in the discussion of Chukas HaGoyim that if you do Mishum Kavod, the Revach, V'Teyalas, it's not Mishum B'chukasem Leiselechu. And this is based on the famous Ma'arik, which we've discussed before in the context more specifically of Chukas HaGoyim. And the Marik said it's very logical. It all depends on the context. And if it's this covered in Revach and Teyelas, then according to Marik it's fine. And the Ramah Taka quoted this. So the fees of Vot Oiske Komen, that there has to be an element of Kedei Hidomos in all these lavim. And if the element of Kedei Hidomos, which requires some kind of bar, some kind of standard of that your mamish being mechaven to copy, l'shem copy. So if you have that, that's also. If you don't have that, then it's hard to make the case that it's usher. So you would have a problem in the cases of shows that are making the shnuim and they're saying it's not liz damas, but it's just for the extra room. So perhaps you were covering for the fact that it's not so pashat to make the case that they're taka being nichshol in Avedas. As we recall, he had this argument about Marasayan, and taka, if you look at the Maram Shik, so Maram Shik says to address this problem, so how do we deal with this problem? So first of all, he says Marik himself said that even if it is l'kavod and l'teyalas, but if there's something that's not roy, mitzad tznius or tam acher, so then it is muchach that you're doing it kadei l'damis. Meaning these are not absolute bars and standards. It's a little subjective, and we sort of have to evaluate in each case: are you doing kadei l'damis or are you doing it innocently? So Maram Shik says taka that in certain cases, perhaps a case like this, we could say that it's muchach, So even if you say that it's not your kavana, so your lack of kavana, dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, we say that it's objectively evident that you're doing a kadei ladamis, you are over on b'chukei seyem. So therefore, Maram Shik agrees that if they're ma'amid the bima kadei ladamis lebati tifla, bevadai this kamalavim, and even if you claim it's mishum arvachas makim, im ki ene borer, if it has mamash and isur deiraisa b'chukei seyem, but because it's already been established that the minig is be'emtza, and you shouldn't be mishan in the minig, and you're changing it, so it's muchach that it's kadei lidamas, and even if you claim it's not, dvarim shebalevinim dvarim. So that's how the Maram Shik deals with this question, with this problem. And then he agrees, v'kol shekein, that l'chol hapachas, this taka, this maris ayin, as you taka argued, the Mechelas HaMachanayim taka argued, lachem bevad l'kliyalma shni abima osir kedivrim alasai, I don't fully agree with what you said and how and why you said it, but I agree with the bottom line. Ayin Shav, the Maram Shik continues even further, but I just wanted to share that point because it's taka a very wichtige point in this discussion. And like I said, and like we'll say, this is taka the weak point here in this whole argument. This is not the only letter of the Maram Shik responding to this chibur around this time. In Maram Shik, Yerdei Sim Reish Tazvav, there's a letter from a few months later, Chav Tammuz Tafresh Yudvav, addressed again to Rabbi Yisroel Dovid of Pezon. He says, I received your letter. So it seems like whatever he had sent earlier maybe didn't have a name yet, maybe it was only a partial manuscript, and then a few months later he sent him an updated version with the title. So I just got it 2 weeks ago. Seemingly alluding to the previous tshuva. And now I'll stel sich on the next point about Kabbalas Rabim, Takoniseyam, Gzidiseyam, Minagim, Imhemanatayra. So seemingly responding maybe to some Beis further in the sefer as to the starkheit of these early Takonis, this early Minhagim, which, like I said, is already something some sefer was being Isaken. But at any rate, it seems possible, based on what I saw so far, that invoking this pasuk and sort of centering this argument, in this fight around this pasuk in Parsha today, that it's mamish befedish, like the pasuk says, echa yavdu. So you have chukiseyim, you have those other things, but lav dafka they're framed as trying to bring Jewish ritual worship practice in line with their modes of worship. Often it focuses on other stuff, stam the clothing that's worn. This you saw this emphasis, this focus on that we're trying to bring the shul, we're trying to bring the tefillah in line with how they pray, how they worship. That's mamish echa yavdu. So this seems to have been perhaps the chap of the Mechelas HaMachanayim. And as we'll see, this sort of actually became a yisoid. Those who discussed this point after him, they often invoked this pasuk, sometimes mentioning him by name, sometimes not. So for example, I just mentioned before that there was a big psak in Hungary, which the Dovid Chaim in Galicia was also involved in, and it's Adayem Azen, the Hungarian Kehilas, they know there's the psak of Tafresh Chavav. Tafresh Chavav, 1866, they put their foot down and they formalized these tainas that Mechelas HaMachanayim was expressing, that the Rabbanim were expressing, but clearly, as he himself alluded to, not all Rabbanim were consistently putting their foot down and saying, I'm going to have to step away if you do this. So these Rabbanim got together and they put their foot down and they said that this is Yehorig Val Yaver. And the psak is reproduced in a few places. Some editions of the Divrei Chaim where they include it among the Tshuvas and Isafes. So if you look at how they formulate it, they mention that we see these shinoyim, and it's kalapish as here the Torah b'chol el b'kam aleisa seva amra b'chokeseyim leisilechu yisham l'chap and tinakash achareyem echa yavdu. So these are talking the psukim that are being invoked. And then a bit later, when they start going through the list of things that are absolutely non-negotiable, so they write shenis. Yedu shekol davar sha'osin l'shanis minhag Yisroel is damois echa yavdu. So this became almost like the shorthand. You're doing echa yavdu. Whoever become a leisase v'chamor me'achilas chazer be'echos v'kamus. That's how they expressed it. That it's worse than eating chazer, both be'echos and be'kamus. Be'kamus, because chazer is just one leisase, and here you have kama leisase. And be'echos plus chazer is not a avodah zarah, and here you have avodah zarah, and it's a suffix as to whether it's Yehorig Val Yaver, as we talk saw in the Mechelas HaMachanayim. So it seems like this psak is building on, echoing, and formalizing the arguments that had been expressed by the Mechelas HaMachanayim, which from the Ram Shik as well. It seems like he was responding to the Mechelas Machanoim being the one to put these arguments on the map. And that's not the only psak. It's other tshuvas as well. We're not going to quote all of them, but you start searching through the tshuvas of Hungarian Rabbanim, they often will quote the pasuk Hisham l'chapan tinakesh echa yavdu. What's interesting to me is that I found this invoked by none other than Rav Kook as well, and that's actually what sort of inspired me and triggered me to put this all together. So Rav Kook also cites this, although he's speaking about the most extreme. If we had to rank the topics we're talking about here, the organ in the shul is all the way at the top. Even Mechelas Machanoim wasn't even addressing it. He makes it sound like the people he was talking to aren't quite holding there yet. They're almost there. That was like full-on reform, and then the shuls that were doing this weren't necessarily fully identifying as reform, but they were heading in that direction, and Mechelas Machanoim is sort of speaking to that particular crowd, where like the organ might be down the road. That's how he expresses it right in the beginning. So Rav Kook, though, is responding specifically to the organ. So the organ is at the top, then comes the bima and shinurim like that, then comes the choir, or maybe the choir comes before the bima, I don't know, and then the chazen's hat is maybe more towards the bottom of the list. So Rav Kook does quote it, but it's the Gabi of the organ, but it's in Shut Oirech Mishpat Oirech Chaim Siman Lamed Vav, it's Shuvah from Tofish Tzaddik Hey, and a point which will also come up later, which is you have all these Rabbanim in Hungary screaming about it, and Adi Yamazeh, you have Kehillas of Hungarians where they mamish feel that the psak of those Rabbanim is mamish b'taikif for their Kehillas. Okay, but what if you're not from those Kehillas? And what if you're not Ashkenazi b'chlal? So do these Yisurim apply? Is this an issue? So someone had argued, there's no name in the tshuva that I can see, but the Inyan Asfardim, that sheyesh mi shemater lehem, to put an organ in the shul, because he says all these surim from Gedolei Rabbi Sinu Achreinim Adoides Hakref Mishal Afanenu Leinamru El Ashkenazim Alei Sfardim. So Rav Kook puts his foot down and says in her Pashit, She'ein Ledvarim Alolu Shum Yisoid, there's no difference between Ashkenazim and Sfardim, except when it comes to individual Menhagim, Machlekes HaPaiskim, you follow the Shita of your rabbis. But if it's Gufei Torah and there's no Machlekes, so then how can you start splitting Klal Yisrael? Torah Achas Lekulanu. So the Isser of the organ and shul, in addition to being Mashmiya Koil, Shabbos and Yom Tov, is also Mitzad Shnei Taimim Chazakim, number one, Mechugasem Leisilechu. Any minig that we see that the Nachrim follow and the Yidden don't follow, that's Bechal Chukas HaGoyim, will be Yichud, Hadavar Chomer, B'Yoser, B'Dvarim, Shehim Noegim, B'Nyonei Avedasam. And then there's this like distinction, this point of how it's specifically bad when it's their mode of worship. Shal Zeh, Steht in Torah, Hisham l'chop and Tinok Shachareim, Leimar Eich Yavdo, Goyim Elis Aleheim, Ve'asa Ken Gamoni. He quotes the Sifri, even if it's Mishum Yefi V'Sif Eres, like the Argomon. So he quotes that as well. Taka gets pulled a little bit into the gray area of the Maharik, where what if it's also Yefi? What if there's also a good reason? It just looks beautiful. But his argument based on his understanding of this Sifri is that sometimes, even when it's clearly beautiful, but it's also clearly the way they do things, so sometimes that overpowers the argument about how it's useful and has good function. So this is a good example. The Argamon is no good. Anything that's in that category, so it's Asr B'Hachlet, even if it has Tayalas. The Hachi Mashma Pasha Dekrash, Leitaimer Eich Yavdo, Goyim Elis Alehem, Ve'asa Gamoni, and therefore the Ugov, which is Mamish from the Dvarim that are Kavua in Bati Apolchan Shalahem, so Bavadi Isish and Asparasim, Rabbi Sinu Achreinim Zal, no Minig, no Chalukideis, it's also L'chol Yisroel. And even if you had a Shaila as to whether it goes into the category of Darkei HaMoedi, which is its own interesting category, but there's B'chal Avardav that it's also to imitate the Minim. It says in the Mishnah Chulin, you're not to shecht into a ditch, into a guma, Shlo Yechakes Aminim, so you have that element here as well. So at least on this Inyan, there's no daylight between the Hungarian Rabbanim and Rav Kook, and Rav Kook is going further, making the point that there's no difference between Ashkenazim and Sfardim. And he already lived, this is already in the 1930s, so they already had enough time to see how things turned out, how things panned out. He says, but Dovid Sha'avru, the claim, the taina was, we're imitating them to come closer to them, we'll chant for them, and then they'll stop hating us. It had no benefit, and the sin only got worse. And Akopanim, those that brought the organ, so Yatsu Miklal Torah, Bahar Begufit Torah, bought to B'Kedushas HaShabbos, Mehem Gam Elish Ozvis Kedushas HaBris, Rabbi Mehem Nosu Noshim Nachriyas, so it was from bad to worse, from the organ to Shabbos to the Bris to intermarriage. So those are certainly not people you want to imitate either, not just the original Goyim, but you don't want to imitate the Reform who did that either. And then he also invokes these Makaitis from Chazal, where in Megillah, person goes over to the Amuds, B'Tzvuin, B'Levanim. So there's very interesting similarities in how Rav Kook is quoting the same types of Makaitis and making the same types of arguments. But again, the focus here is specifically, though, on something as outrageous, you could say, as the organ. And he goes on and concludes the tshuva in that vein, that there's for sure no difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Interestingly, at the end, there's like a shorter letter that's addressed to someone with a particular name. I didn't have a chance to go look up who he was and where he lived and what Kehillah, maybe it reveals the story was happening with. But he's sort of writing a more personal letter, B'hamshach, to the formal letter, and he says, I received your questions about the Ugav and the organ, and I was very busy and it took time. I thought that it was enough to just send a telegraphic message that it's Asur L'chol Yisroel. But since you asked me to write a tshuva b'vir, so this is my tshuva b'vir, v'yesh laharach mo'ed b'inyan zeh, shu echad miyusedi das, te'resenu ha'kdaisha, that we can't imitate dark Avodas Hashem Yisbarach l'derech pulchan hazarim, but this is hinini muchrich l'katzer, this is the short version of it. Going back to the Maram Shik, it's interesting that he, in later years, he went on to quote this sefer a number of times as the go-to makar, Mechelas HaMachnoim, as the go-to makar on this topic. So in Maram Shik, Eirach Chaim, Simenayin Aleph, is a tshuva from Thomas Tavish Chavav to the Mart Chaleb Klein of Miklash. And the Shoyal was asking that they had made Shinuyim, it was one of these shows where they made Shinuyim, clearly not outright reform, but they had made these Shinuyim that the Hungarian Rabbanim said is Chok V'Yaver. And he wasn't sure whether to quit for Parnasa. He gave Shiurim there, so he was sort of stuck. But it was Tavish Chavav. So up until Tavish Chavav, there was a gray area. But now, Tavish Chavav, they just put out the big psak. The psak says that it's an Isser Godol and that the Isser is worse than Chazer. We just saw that quote before. And it's a suffix if it's Yehodik Val Yaver. So you wrote to me that you hold it's not Yehodik Val Yaver and it's not as bad as Chazer and he doesn't know what to do. So Maram Shik says, when it comes to these questions of the choir, and the bottom line is, if you're Meshanim and Hagi Yisroel, and you bring it in line with Ma'aseh Dasa Sh'ari Umas Ha'olam, Yo'evin Mekamalavim, at the Rambam wrote in Perek Aleph Hilchos Avodah Zarah, Ubirer B'Yoser Sefer Mechelas HaMachnoim V'Sham Chashash T'Yesh B'Mishum Yehodik V'Yaver. You see the Maram Shik, when asked about the psak, and sort of asked for the basis behind the psak, he points to the sefer Mechelas HaMachnoim. I wrote for Kasafti that I don't think it's Yehodik V'Yaver, and also I made a distinction that who is over on the lavim? It's those who make the shinuyim. But someone who just lives there and comes into daven, he doesn't have another shul, and l'chayr he's not over on the lavin. So we have to be clear about who we're addressing our invective at. But mikol makim, I would hold that it's also b'nei Torah to daven there, even though you're not being over on the lavim, but it's also to be nitpol la'evrei aveda, and nitpol la'evrei aveda ka'evrei aveda. Even if you don't daven there, but you just stand there, you sit there when they daven with the choir. So interesting that you can see that the Rebbe Rashab also treated it on this level. That Yimam Mishnah to step foot in there, even though technically it was a reform or wasn't a reform, without even getting into those distinctions. It's just the Shinuyim themselves, without the ideology, the Shinuyim themselves were considered completely passing of the status of the shul. So that's how the Maram Shik begins his response, and then he goes on and he says that you wrote to me that the Rabbanim said it's worse than Achilas Chazer, and you tie in that it's not as bad as Achilas Chazer. He says, since when is that the standard? If it's not as bad as Achilas Chazer, so then it's fine. Although the Maisa, they had written that Lashon, and perhaps some would say that's representative of the style of those Rabbanim and how they wrote and how they write till today. So if you put Achilas Chazer in your statement and someone starts taking issue with it, and then you take issue with the fact that they're taking issue, okay, sure. At any rate, the rest of the tshuva is also interesting, but we can't focus on everything here. We're just focusing on tshuvas, where Maram Shik then quoted the sefer later on, and talk another tshuva Shintes from Tafresh Chavtes, which is sort of written in response and reaction to there was a congress in Pest about the question of the Jewish community and whether there's one community or more than one community. This question of Tailung, and at that point, they were still trying to sort of claim that there's one Jewish community and they're the ones in charge. And Maram Shik is making the case to the contrary. So in one of the paragraphs there, which he responds to at length, he says in one of the paragraphs, it says that if there's a kahila, if there's a city, they have to be one community, which is a point that I've mentioned in other contexts that today is mostly forgotten. Comes up a little bit in New Square, Kiryas Yoel, but and even there, Kiryas Yoel is splintered at this point. But this idea, this Gedanken Amal, every geographic location had one kahila. So the neologs were seizing on that if we're the Roiv, you have to be part of our kahila. So he said, Takal pidin Torah, if it's kat achas hadin kain. But if they're oivei chadashis, they have an orgel and a karshal, and an orgel is a te'eveli Yisroel, like the Goinim B'der Shel Fanein already 50 years ago said. There was a sefer Divrei Habris, and the Chassam Sefer already touched on it a little bit. And then these additional shinuyim, the karshulin that they're making, and the shinuyim, the chazanim, the hidomois labate tiflis, zeh oslan b'din Torah, like it says in the Rambam, Perkei Alf, V'edazara, u'b'sefer mecheles amachanoyim. And therefore, a kosher yid can't be Messiah de Oivdei Aveda, and you can't be part of one kehila. Adrabah, you're mechuyev to split from them. Not only that, as far as we're concerned, Lefi, our Mahalach, they're the ones who split off already. We're still Klal Yisrael. You left Klal Yisrael. You're doing something else. So by trying to force us to be subservient to you, it's like stealing our freedom of religion. We want to practice Judaism, and you're forcing us to follow some other faith. That's how he writes it and expresses it. And once again, he's quoting Mechilas Machanoim as the source for this Yisoid. Other poskim, you have the Levoshe Mordechai, who quotes it. He writes, "Val kulam sevivim beneflois divrim mechilas hamachanoim asher harich with an aleph, harich with an ayin levarich ki im oisim ledamis lehem oividim al zayin lavim." Levoshe Mordechai in this particular tshuva, or the Chaim Rodotionis in Pevav, and in other places, and other poskim from Hungary. But even more recently, some of the poskim more recently do quote it as well in Shut Shevet Halevi Chelik Aleph Simon Chavav, written to the famous Helmut Tzarav, Chananya Yom Tov Lipa Deutsch. There was a shaila, they were building a shul, and they wanted to have an organ, and there's this nashim, and they said it's not for Shabbos and Yom Tov, so they were tiny. What's the problem? And the Shevet Levi says, of course, it's aser, it's a shinui miderech Rabbi Seinu, mashahim mekadem, iser val titoish, and additionally v'chukasem leiselechu, and see the Rambam and the Sifri. For Yedua, he says that all this stuff, like the organ, it's all pre-hisdamos la'ev davei dezara mamash. Comes back to this point that they're imitating davei dezara. Like kama her issue al zeh talmidei mar nachsam sefer b'tkufas hamulchama leman hayadus acharedes, when they wanted to change sidrei batei knesses v'ayim b'tshuvas mecheles hamachanoyim mi simen aleph ad simen ches, which was natak bekitzer by the goyin hatzadik baal leiv ivri. And it's also part of the Tzavad Chassam Sefer. He said not to change the Sidri Batei Knesses because the writing was on the wall. So the Shevet HaLevi quotes it in that tshuva, or it sounds like an early tshuva in his career. The Tzitz Eliezer in Chelik Hey has a psicha where he sort of goes through the issue, the question, the problem of reform, going through different categories. So in the Chelik Hey, Psicha Perek Beis, where he talks about the reform shuls, the reform temples, so he surveys the issue and he writes, Gam kafishim isbarer b'sefer mecheles machanoyim yoytze ki amavaker b'vat tiflei sayam over bekama lavin. And then he quotes Maram Shik. Maram Shik holds that the lavin is just for those who do it, but someone who davens there, who doesn't have another shul, wouldn't be over on the lavin, but it would still be aser mishom nitpol b'daver. So he summarizes the mecheles machanoyim and the Maram Shik that we saw. So the Tzitz Eliezer is also using this material in his discussion of these issues today. One issue that I would point out today, which Maram Shik was already getting at even Bismanoi, and again we're talking about those that are not officially splitting off and starting a new movement, reform, but today there could be many shuls that are nominally, officially Orthodox, but there could be this kind of shinui, that kind of shinui, komine shinuyim, some of which echo these older shinuyim. So the shaila would be that back then there was this ideology, there was the shidduchos mahalach, that's the fruma shuls, they're nebuchdik, and it's a tomo, a cacophony, and that was why they wanted to make these shinuyim not to call up people to the Torah. Mecheles Machanoim refers to the Taina at one point that sometimes two people have the same name and they call up, and then there's a tumul. Who do they actually call up? Why are we having a tumul in Shul? It's like a Malava Malka, Shal Shudus in here. Let's make it all nice and clean and quiet and formal. And I think historically, if you look at Ashkenazi shuls, I don't think all shuls at all times were all so tumuldic. And you go to the more Yekish shuls, and they do seem to be more calm and quiet and staid and formal. But at any rate, that was the issue. That was part of what was driving it. There were those who weren't necessarily fully ideologically trying to break off, but they were bothered by the fact that the shul wasn't following the Seder Masudar, and to some extent they were looking to La'avdil to see how things are done there, and taking inspiration from there. That was clearly part of it. The shaila is, what about today? First of all, new shinuyim, and second of all, even some of those old shinuyim, the back then were clearly being done with that in mind. And even if you claimed innocence, but you could tie it and say, look, so many people are changing it for this reason, you can't play dumb. Whereas today, lav dafka. So let's say the bima and the shul, like I said, today there are many shuls and shuls that I've seen, especially the less formal ones that aren't even the binyan isn't miyuchad lebeis haknesses. So the Amud is here, and the Aron is there, and the Bima is there, and Chassidish Shtiblach, it's hard to see, it's hard to tell whether there's any diuk and akpada of exactly where it should be, where it shouldn't be. So it comes back to that shaila of what if you're not doing it lezdamis, you're doing it l'shem yoifi, l'shem revach. So, of course, it does depend on which issue we're talking about. We're talking about different issues, different categories that can have other factors as well. But even let's say music. In the past, I did a shir is musical Hallel reform. So if you just take it literally and look at the Makairis and copy the Makairis directly into today's context, it's easier to make the case that it's taka problematic. But if you say, look, back then, there was a particular mode of music, the organ and the choir, there was a certain style of worship that they were trying to imitate, whereas today, could be there are Lavdil other places of worship today that also have more up-to-date popular music, and maybe there is a certain dimyan, but on the other hand, the oilam is not looking, we're pretty disconnected most of the time, we're not aware of what they're doing, we're not looking over our shoulder, we're not trying to find favor, to be machnif, it's a totally different dynamic today. It could be that certain modes of behavior sort of filter down and trickle down unbeknownst and unconsciously, but no one that we know of is making a shinui in shul or bringing music into shul, but azam and kavana, and we're not talking about bringing the organ itself into shul, we're talking about bringing other instruments into shul. So lefidus yisod lefidus mahalach, it's not so pashataka just to pull out those psakim. If you're from those Hungarian kahillas that consider those rabbanim psak to be binding la'il me'ad, so that's another type of discussion. But if we're just talking about the inyan itself, the logic itself, it's nishta zay klar. As I was thinking about this, first of all, that's Maram Shik himself. Margulies-Jaffe-Schlesinger and Maram Shik themselves were sort of addressing this, and they had a good counter argument based on the context of their time. But what if it wouldn't be the context of their time? So then they're sort of perhaps conceding that's Nishla Say Pasha. But after I was having this machshava, I actually saw that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef Yabia Omer Taka made this point at great length in Shut Yabia Omer Chelik Ches Eir Chaim Simon Yud Zayin, written to a Moroccan Rav, Vidui Monsignego. And Ovadia Yosef is responding to a chibur by this Rav called Shut Pa'as Yom Al Dal Chalki Shulchan Aruch, and he was asking Ovadia for a haskama. So Ovadia was looking through the sefer, and apparently right at the beginning, Chelik Eir Chaim Simon Beis, they were talking about the bima, and there was a shul, seemingly Morocco, where they were redoing the shul, and Mistama, they were updating the style and the design, and they wanted to move the bima from the middle to the corner, and others were saying, no, it has to be in the middle. And this Rav was being masked, and he was quoting the Steichamer and the Chasam Sefer, Vitzian Oid, the Dovid Harav, Mocheles Machanoim. So this Rav Morocco was taka aware of and quoting the Mocheles Machanoim as the makar, that it's Yisoid Musud, Ashikamat, Kol HaTorah, initial of these Lashinas. So Rabbi Yosef says that I remember already 30 years ago, I was asked by a Rav in Argentina about this shaila, because they had a similar argument as well. So Ravad just starts going into the Mekaydes. When it comes to the Bima in particular, so one of the big Nukudas is that the Rambam Taka mentions that the Bima should be in the middle. But the Kesef Mishnah Shtalzachan and says, Lav dafka, not everyone does it in the middle. So back then it wasn't this highly charged, politicized topic, whatever you want to call it. So the Rambam Taka says what he says, but the Kesef Mishnah said, Lav dafka. So then the question is, how does that factor into the discussion now? So Dr. Vad Yosef, that the whole shtorim of the Goyni Yisroel Ba'artis Ashkenaz, to be makbid, they were fighting against the reform in Lamineim, and the reform in turn were trying to ledamoisam ulahashvoisam leknesiyos ulabati tiflus shel hanoitzinim. And he quotes it. There's already a Noid Rabbi Yehuda, the Noid Rabbi Yehuda Madurat Tinyana Chelik Eirachayim Siman Yud Ches, was asked about people who wanted to build a shul in the shape of an octagon, Baal Shmeinet Lois. So what's the problem? So Noid Rabbi Yehuda already said that even though there's no Isser Adin, but if you're trying to imitate some kind of style, you saw Heichal Yisarim, Kaide Ani Aleim, Vayishkach Yisroel Eisehu, Vayiven Heichalos. So when Yidden go astray, that's sort of the thing that tends to happen. They start building Heichalos in the incorrect fashion. He's paraphrasing. You have to check Noid Rabbi Yehuda to see if it's exactly how the Noid Rabbi Yehuda wrote it. I didn't look it up. So this is where they're coming from. So there was the reform, and the reform in turn were copying the Knesiyos, so Kol Shekain to be Mizdama, Takamish directly to Oib the Elilim. So the Goyni Yisroel Yetze connected B'chol HaToikef, Charamis and Yisurim, and they stood up, B'oizu B'tushia, V'chein Mevur B'shut Maram Shik, to bring Machavin, Masayim, Lamanahage, Avoidish Aru Umis, to bring Oivern, Chukasem Leiselechu, and Yisham Lacham Matina Kashachareyam, all the raid that we are all familiar with. And even if they claim it's Laharvachas Amakim just for the space, but Chalapachas, this Maris Ayin, all these inyanim that we just went through ourselves earlier in this discussion. Then he's mitzayint a few other Hungarian Shals Shuvas, Sefer Kasa Danya, Pekudas Elazar, Minchas Yitzchak, Teres Chaim Sefer. He quotes the Shut She'el Shalom that addresses the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah was Malamed Schos. That was back then, Kavanasam Shem Shemaim. It was talking only the Harvacha V'noi. But now, with the Minas and Apikourses, Chalil, Lashanis, Makim Habima, etc. So Zakti B'yomer, Bissel weiter dorten, that Maram Shik himself expressed pretty clearly that the whole var was Liz Damais, and others say this as well. Places where reform never happened. Mitzrayim, Morocco, Sebazoi, you can pretend this whole story never happened, and we're back to the Kesef Mishnah. We could be Mekel if it's Mishum Noi, Avachas Beis HaKnesses, people are coming with innocent reasons, nothing to do with that, so it shouldn't be a problem. Then he adds a line to Bekahai Gavna Le Gozru Go'ene Ashkenaz, and we'll get to this point. There's really 2 points here. There's the logic, and then there's the treating it like Exeda. And he goes off into this vart about Gzedas, and whether a Gzeda in one place could be B'toike for another place. Interesting Mar Mekayim is Taka, which is Kedai. It's Taka very relevant to this Shiloh. Let's say all the Hungarian Rabbanim said what they said. Would it be B'toike for people in other Kehilas or not? He gets a bit into that. But we're going to be Mekatzer here. We have to tie this up neatly in a bow. But at any rate, so Rabbi Yosef is writing now to this Rav Morocco, Zui Teichen Shuvasi, that I wrote already 30 years ago to Argentina. So I'm repeating it back to you because I just saw in your sefer that you're taking the more stringent stance. So I'm telling you that I think in the Sephardic, Eastern Sephardic context where they weren't affected, talking about places that weren't affected by reform that way, so he doesn't see the problem. And so, yeah, this was along the lines of what I was thinking. I mean, I'm not just quoting it out, so, I found a heter, or this is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. To me, I look for the logic. I look for the Yisroel. It needs to be like an internally consistent, logical point, and that's where I came to this from. And so, seeing that Rabbi Yosef expressed it, I think enhances that point. I'm happy to see that was a Rav Paisik thinking along these lines. But it's still, like I said earlier, it sort of depends on which category we're talking about. You talk about the organ is basically impossible to defend, because no one today would want to have it unless they are following in the footsteps of Reform, who are following in the footsteps of whatever churches they were copying. Doing that, even today, it's basically pretty obvious that there could be no other reason other than to be imitating someone along that chain. But like other instruments that I mentioned, where that's not really the case, so then it's harder to make the same argument. And that's also the difference between Rav Kook and Rabbi Yosef. Rav Kook, Taka took the strict stance, but he was talking about an organ. Yibi Omer takes a more lenient stance, but he's talking about the placement of the bima, where there's even a Kesef Mishnah that says that it's lav dafka ma'akiv and a must. Elamai, Ravadia also alluded to the question of, do we treat it like a gzeira? So there's bachal, the shiloh of gzeiras, and the takeover of gzeiras. Let's say, for the Hungarians and the Ungarische Kehilas, they take it as a gzeira. But the shiloh is, what about everybody else? What about other Kehilas Ashkenazim? Like I said, in Eastern Europe, it wasn't akadekach, it never came to that extent, for whatever the reasons were, whatever the differences were. And whichever shoals became Kalia, so if you were a Haredi, you didn't step foot in them, and if you were less Haredi, maybe you did step foot in them, and no one was policed, it wasn't being policed and fought out in that kind of fashion. So again, in the Kehilas that identify as a hemshech to those Kehilas in Hungary, and that they're a hemshech to those Gedolim and Poiskim, and they still have that awareness. They talk about the takanas of Tafish Chavav, and that's why English is puzzle, because back then German and Hungarian were puzzle. Fine, but how is it ma'akiv for other Kehilas? Elamai. There was a time where any shul that was making these changes anywhere, even in Eastern Europe, it was probably the same logic, and the Fruma Yidden would have reacted similarly, and they would have maybe turned to those Paiskim from Hungary and said, oh, you see how they articulated it? Yeah, we're being chayshish to that. But that was in the context where they were being mizdame. Whereas today, there are many Shinoyim, there are many Orthodox shows that are just, they're not looking to tradition, they're not looking to how a show was built in Eastern Europe 300 years ago to inform what the exact design and layout of the shul should be today, where the Ezras Nashim should be, where the bima should be, where the seats should be, how they're designed. You have a lot of shuls that are completely designed in new modernist fashion. There's a lot going on. I don't know about the Hamish Kehilas per se. In the Hamish Kehilas, there's other questions as to whether they're building shuls in the proper way or they're less formal shuls. But you go beyond the Hamish territory, so usually the shuls are sort of proper shuls. But I'll go for Lav Dafka, it's the exact same format. So there could be many reasons, and there is certainly no push. There's no momentum to copy the non-Jews or to copy reform. So it's fair to say that because Rabbanim in Hungary put out an Isser in Tafish Chavav, so some Kehillah in America is beholden to that. So this is where the Rebbe's letters comes into the picture. I didn't go looking it up specifically. I do remember that I think there are places where the Rebbe sort of cited it or invoked it and alluded to it and said, oh, the Rabbanim already said that it's Aser. But one would have to take a look at it, and I would argue that Lav Dafka, it's being stated as an absolute. And back in the 50s and the 60s, there still were many shuls that were still in flux and were still considering following in the footsteps of the reform. So the dynamic that those Paiskim were describing, the Teichen, not the Gzeira without the Teichen itself of being Mizdama, either to the Noitzrim or at least being Mizdama to the Reformim, would still have been very much in play even when the Rebbe was writing and reacting and responding. And I think there's evidence that in other aspects and other respects, the Rebbe didn't necessarily make a macha every time certain shinuim were made, maybe other shinuim, I don't know about the bima per se, but in the 70s and 80s, I think shuls already were doing interesting things and making interesting shinuim, and it's not clear to me if when it was clear that it has nothing to do with imitating a particular mode of worship, whether the Rebbe would have considered it ma'akiv, because Rabbanim in Hungary said that it's ma'akiv. Comes to chuppah, lamashal, chuppah is also something that tends to be followed because of that whole controversy to continue doing it outside versus inside. Although, of course, you have many who sort of do it inside and they just remove the ceiling, which, okay, it's hard to know whether they're chopping the ikar or the tafel. Obviously in Chabad, the chuppah is done outside. But like I said, you can rank them. There's each shinoi is really slightly different than the next. You can't necessarily be madama them 100% to each other. So if the reasoning doesn't apply and the gzeira, the goizerim, how exactly is their authority so absolutely binding for everyone? So it's ken takazayin. You can make the case that it's not ma'akiv so much. I personally am all for studying the history and sticking to the history and the tradition, and I would love to see shuls keep to the exact dimensions and proportions and placements and manhagim, and it's great. But a shaila as to whether the rest of the Orthodox world is beholden to those Hungarian Rabbanim today, I'm not convinced that that is necessarily the case. Just to conclude, I looked in Chabad sources. I didn't see a major discussion regarding this particular pasuk of Hishamer Pentinakesh Echa Yavdu. I did see that the Rebbe once mentioned the pasuk in a talk, Chav Vav Menachem Av Tavshim Mem Hey. The Rebbe spoke to Tif'eres Zikenim Chachmes Nashim. So it seems that it's a crowd of the elderly, programs for both the elderly men and the elderly women. And the Rebbe Kedarkai quoted from the different shiurim. So the Rebbe quoted from the shiur of Chumash HaYomi, and the Rebbe quoted these psukim: Ki Yachris, Hisham Lacha Pentinakesh, Pentidroish, Echa Yavdu, Ki Sishma B'Kal Hashem Alekecha, L'Shmer Es Kol Mitzvaysav. And the Rebbe said that when Yidden look around them and they see many nations that have different minhag and different practices, to the extent that there's some who serve Avodah Zarah, whether kipshuta or in the spiritual sense, chasing money, the Egel Azav, and other taivas, you have to know that you're not allowed to learn from their deeds. Echa Yavdu, Ve'esakin Gamani, you're not allowed to do that. So interestingly, the Rebbe was quoting it, but in a much broader sense. And every child sort of grows up and we're told, don't do this, don't do that. Why shouldn't you do this? Why shouldn't you do that? Because it's goyish. What exactly does that mean? What exactly are the parameters? This is something that maybe some of us struggle with or struggle to understand. So it's interesting to see how the Rebbe broadens the Eicha Yavdu, and as we saw earlier, there is a category of Chukas HaGayim, which itself isn't always so clear and straightforward. So perhaps in addition to the Chukas HaGayim, there's also this Eicha Yavdu. In the context earlier, Eicha Yavdu was presented as even worse. Like not only it's Chukas HaGayim, but it's Mamish Eicha Yavdu, and you're bringing it into the show. But the way the Rebbe is saying it, it's also Eicha Yavdu is also maybe in the broader sense that you're sort of taking their values and their approach to life and what they hold dear and precious in life and what they value, and internalizing those values and those morals. It's also Eicha Yavdu Leisasakein, and it's also possible to bring the chase for kavod and gelt and taiva into Yiddishkeit in certain ways, as some of us are probably aware. So that's also a bechina of Eicha Yavdu, and it all comes from the same Yisoid.